Thank you all. It's a real privilege to be here, and I thank the conference organizers for this opportunity. What I would like to talk about this morning is structuring knowledge in evolutionary biology, and I'd like to begin by posing a question. How do you envision knowledge is structured in evolutionary biology? And you might take this question and look at it in the context of your own research. If you are a scientist, this is a descriptive task. You're saying, what does it look like in the areas where I work? How is knowledge structured there? You might think more broadly about how it looks like it's structured in other areas. In addition to a descriptive question that you might ask yourself about the structure of knowledge, you might also wonder what you should expect it to look like. That is, it might descriptively look one way, but you might expect it to look another way. This is a normative question, a question about whether or not the structure of the knowledge should take a certain form. Now, these sorts of questions about the structure of knowledge are clearly something that philosophers get interested and excited about, but at the same time, I think there are scientific motivations for this kind of exercise. Here is Sean Carroll talking, I think, along these lines. He says, do questions posed about Evo-devo and evolutionary theory matter to anyone besides the specialists and a few future historians? I think the answers matter very much. Without theories to organize and interpret facts, without the power of general explanations, we are left with just piles of case studies. Moreover, we are without the frameworks that enable us to make predictions about any particular case. So this concern about the sort of organization of knowledge, not just its content, is something that I think has value to ongoing scientific research. Now, in thinking about those expectations, I think it's relevant to the topic of this conference. Ongoing debates about the possibility and the status of an extended evolutionary synthesis often involve disagreements about the nature and significance of particular phenomena or mechanisms, and I think this is popping up in talks all over the place during this conference. However, assumptions regarding how to structure knowledge about those phenomena and mechanisms in evolutionary biology remain largely implicit in these conversations. Implicit in the sense that there is structure, there are ways in which this is being structured, it's just not being talked about as such. Now, if you think about some of the ways in which this is, pops out in discussions of the EES more broadly, we have figures of the following kind that attempt to visualize the EES, this one from Pigliucci and Mueller, this one from Dennis Noble a couple years later, and this one more recently from Alejandro and Francisco, who you heard talk yesterday, where they try to give a different representation of some similar material. Now, the interesting thing is to what degree we're getting genuine sort of information about the structuring of evolutionary biology by paying attention to these sorts of things. Clearly, they are attractive in trying to capture something about the EES, but are they really helpful or even accurate? So I think greater attention to these assumptions about how to structure knowledge and the expectations they foster has the potential to reveal two things: the conceptual basis of some existing controversies about theoretical frameworks in evolutionary biology, and provide some novel ways of structuring our evolving knowledge for future interdisciplinary inquiry. So in this sense, fulfilling some of what Sean Carroll was hoping for in actually fostering ongoing research. So here's a basic outline of what I want to talk about today. I'll begin with some orientation about the distinction between structure and content. Then I will walk through some samples of structure, what structure might look like, some options. Then I will talk about strategies. How would you go about finding and adopting structure for evolutionary biological knowledge? I'll briefly apply it in the context of Evo-devo being situated in evolutionary biology. And then I'll close by talking about pluralism and the importance of what I will argue is structuring knowledge contextually. And I'll say more about that when I get to that point. So let's start with some orientation, structure versus content. Metaphors of extension and expansion suggest a need to increase the empirical and theoretical content of evolutionary theory or enlarge the boundaries of the theory such that more things are encompassed within it. So you can see this is embedded in the very name. It's an extended synthesis, right? This extension is kind of part of what is emphasized. However, importantly, you always extend from something or expand out from something, and that suggests the preservation of a chunk of what is in standard evolutionary theorizing. Now, in that preservation, I think Massimo Pigliucci back in 2007 was sort of the first to recognize that maybe expansion or extension in a more mundane way was not going to be adequate, and he introduced this notion of what I am calling a significant extension. Evolutionary biologists have responded to various crises by augmenting the pre-existing framework, building on what was already there without overthrowing any of the previous foundations. Yet, many insist that paradigm shift or not, the modern synthesis is in need of some significant extension. Now, what exactly significant extension is turns out to be a really important question, and we're going to be talking about that, but in some ways this was more glimpsed than it was articulated at the time. Later, Leyland et al. Sort of bring this back up in their 2015 paper. Our analysis suggests that the EES is more than simply an extension of business as usual science. It requires conceptual change. The additional evolutionary processes that the EES highlights are more than just non-essential add-ons and may be as important in shaping evolution as those recognized within the field over the past century. Consequently, the requisite changes are non-trivial. So again, significant, non-trivial. In this case, the idea of conceptual change is invoked, but somehow this extension is supposed to be more than just adding on. And I think that even though people continue to use the metaphor of spatial increase in descriptions of the EES, I think that organizational rearrangement or conceptual change seems more appropriate in many of the cases, and I don't think you have to look very far. If we just stay with the Leyland et al. Paper, you can see when they talk about inheritance conceptualized more inclusively, evolution defined more broadly, or relevant evolutionary processes increased, that in each of these cases, what is in mind is a substantial conceptual revision or some kind of rearrangement of the knowledge that we have that is not simply a kind of accretion of the current theoretical architecture. I think that there's good reason to actively avoid the spatial container metaphor that's sort of embedded in these sorts of visualizations. And in part, it's because these visualizations assume that evolutionary theory has some kind of uncomplicated structure. We don't get anything other than a sort of core, something in the center, with radiation out from that middle. But we don't get a good sense of how different areas of evolutionary biology are interconnected, in what ways they're needed, say, to pursue particular kinds of research problems, and the similar sorts of concerns about using it in practice. So, but when you combine this with the assumption that there's only one evolutionary theory, there's something out there that we're calling evolutionary theory, the appeal of the spatial metaphor is difficult because then it's about, well, there is this thing called evolutionary theory, we can draw a circle around it, make sure we have everything in it, and then that's sort of reminding us of what is or isn't in evolutionary theory, but that doesn't tell us very much about how to do this activity of reorganization or redefinition. What would that look like? Well, in the case of something like these diagrams, it's maybe moving the particular geometric shapes around or moving a concept, but it actually is, I think, not that informative to think about the EES in that way. So just to be clear, right, when I just talk about structure as opposed to content. Content is what is in the theory. Structure is how the content is organized. You can organize the same content in different ways. You can take different content and organize it similarly. That's part of the reason why we want to keep those two apart. But importantly, I think, to date, right, the explicit concern has primarily been about content. Right? If you look at a lot of the debates that have ensued, the concern is this really something we need to include or not? And less of a discussion about whether or not we need to reorganize the knowledge. And a related issue to that is to recognize that content and structure might have some interesting interrelations with each other, and that's important for thinking about the structure, because it might be that in bringing in new content, we might actually force or encourage new kinds of structure. So the challenge is then, given that some of these discussions don't have this structure explicit, how should we do it? How should we structure evolutionary biological knowledge to guide inquiry and sort of have the science structured in such a way that we can learn more, as well as make sure we have a codification of what we have already learned? So that brings me to the samples, because at this point you might want to know, well, what would structure look like? So here are 5 structural options. They're not mutually exclusive. I'm going to talk about each of them just a little bit. Standard philosophical views of scientific theories, or classical philosophical views of science. Mathematical first principles, or a small set of core axioms. Different perspectives with alternative interpretations. Styles of reasoning, and decentralized problem structure. Now, these are not the only types of structure that you might adopt. What I'm hoping that you get is some samples to see just that you do have a choice, that there are some different options. So let's start with some of the standard material from philosophy of science. Some of you may have encountered this elsewhere. Much of the discussion about theory structure in traditional philosophy of science has focused on 3 different options. A syntactic option, which involves construing theories as axiomatic deductive systems that are mathematically formalized with a small set of general regularities from which all the others can be derived. Semantic view is a family of formal models that specifies entities and properties plus their dynamics, and it's represented in terms of set theory or state spaces, right? So the important thing to notice here is that you've got slightly different ways of thinking about what you need to organize. Notice in the semantic view, there's no need to have a small set of general regularities that everything is organized around in the same way that you would on the syntactic view. And then the pragmatic view focuses on the diverse model types and modeling practices, such as idealization, that yield relatively heterogeneous theoretical structure and without an expectation of a single form. So that's just options from the traditional literature that you might adopt. Now, if you were looking for the structure of science, some terms that might be familiar to you, you could think about it in a Kuhnian way. You could think about it as a paradigm. You could think about it in terms of Imre Lakatosh's idea of research programs. These are some other options for thinking about how the knowledge could be structured in that domain. Closely related to the idea of a small set of regularities from which you can derive other things is this idea of structure as mathematical first principles, or a small set of core axioms. This is something that has been popular ever since Euclid did it for geometry more than 2,000 years ago. Within the context of evolutionary biology, I think a number of people have articulated positions similar to this. Michael Lynch being one, the litmus test for any evolutionary hypothesis must be its consistency with fundamental population genetic principles. Population genetics provides an essential framework for understanding how evolution occurs. Lisa Lloyd has given a gloss on this. If you can characterize formal population genetics, then you've characterized the guts or the core of evolutionary theory. And Sean Rice, offering a different perspective, but related to this broad view of structure. Evolutionary theory is not just a collection of separately constructed models, but is a unified subject in which all the major results are related to a few basic biological and mathematical principles. Importantly, these are not the same view. That is, Rice or Lynch or others are not offering the identical structure, but what they are, I think, is offering structure that fits within this family of a small set of core axioms. A third option is one that I think will be more familiar to people because it's illustrated in some of the existing literature on the EES, and that's that different perspectives framed around different core assumptions can yield different interpretations, or conceptual frameworks they're sometimes called. So you might think that classical evolutionary theory defines evolutionary processes in terms of changes in gene frequencies, whereas advocates of an EES often define evolutionary processes in terms of anything that systematically biases the direction or rate of evolution. As a consequence of that, those different central assumptions provide scaffolding for distinct conceptual frameworks that can be constructed and evaluated according to different standards, okay, in addition to empirical adequacy. So you might have standards like the following: does a particular type of causal factor, natural selection, niche construction, operate in a systematic fashion across all contexts? Or can unambiguous general predictions be made about the effects of a type of causal factor? Now, you may or may not like those standards. Part of the point of this approach is that those standards would be something that different conceptual frameworks would disagree about and have different ways of articulating. But I think what you get in, again, Leyland et al.'s paper is a nice laying out of here are what you would think of as different core assumptions between the modern synthesis and the EES. And for any of those, you can zoom in on them to say just how that core assumption really makes a difference in the conceptualization of the knowledge. So in this case, just zooming in on the causation question, right? The traditional view and the recognition of natural selection as the primary evolutionary cause, and the EES view in which that is expanded out to think about more than natural selection as an evolutionary cause. And importantly, notice that things like developmental plasticity or niche construction are recognized as things in the traditional view. They're just not given the same significance. Okay, and that's the important thing about these different conceptual frameworks. They can acknowledge the existence of the same things in the world, but they might attribute different significance to them based on these sorts of core assumptions, right? And then you might flesh it out, and again, I am taking Alejandro and Francisco's diagram here from their recent paper, which is a redrawing of the one from Leyland et al., to try and flesh out where are the commitments of this particular conceptual framework in how, say in this case, the evolutionary process is being conceptualized, and then where our knowledge would be organized and where it would make its contribution in understanding the evolutionary process. That would lead then to interpretations, right? Here, side by side, traditional interpretations and EES interpretations of the phenomena and mechanisms, and that's what you would expect on this sort of structuring, that once you had set up a conceptual framework, that it would yield these different interpretations. A fourth kind of structure is what I call styles of reasoning. It's maybe a more ancient structuring of biological knowledge, in particular through the lens of form and function, something that goes back far beyond evolutionary considerations. But you might think of knowledge being organized along styles of reasoning that biologists adopt in thinking about evolution. They might have a populations and function orientation, where evolutionary change from one phenotype to another is explained via population processes such as natural selection, which sorts phenotypes, alters allele frequencies, and yields outcomes that are frequently, though not exclusively, adaptive. In contrast, you might have a different style of reasoning where you work with organisms in structure and see evolutionary change from one ontogeny to another being explained by a variety of developmental and genetic or epigenetic processes that can be altered in different ways to produce novel morphologies in organisms. Finally, decentralized problem structure. The last one that I will mention here is the one that I have been trying to articulate over the last decade or so. Evolutionary biology can be characterized in terms of different problems or complex explanatory projects, which I call problem agendas pursued by biologists. In this case, no single or primary theoretical structure serves to coordinate or organize work in all evolutionary domains. The idea of a complete unification or synthesis, whether it's modern or extended, is jettisoned. Instead, the relevant assumptions and criteria of adequacy will be relative to a domain of research questions. So to go back to my earlier comment, this is a case in which the content and the structure are closely intertwined. Structure will depend on what kind of problem you're working on. Therefore, the coordination of assumptions and configuration of models will vary across all of evolutionary biology. You won't expect to find the same sort of structure in different places. So that's not exhaustive. That's just samples, all right? You could bring in more. I didn't bring in, say, Alejandro and Francisco's view that they recently advocated, and I said nothing about the ways in which there are connections among the different views, right? Some of you may have noticed that there's overlap or some alliances between different views of structure, and so that's important. They're not mutually exclusive. However, what we need to take away from this is there's many different ways to structure knowledge. There's not just one way to do it, okay? And so then you have a question, which is why choose one form of structure over another, right? What is going to motivate that sort of choice and guide you to go one way or the other? So then that brings us to strategies, how we would find or adopt knowledge structure that's relevant for evolutionary biology. So in doing that, I've recently tried to flesh out what I think are two different structures for how you might find and identify that in evolutionary biology. What I call abstract structure first and concrete practice first. They're relatively descriptive, but let me tell you a little bit about how they work. So for abstract structure first, as you might imagine, identify or articulate an account of scientific theory structure abstractly, and then ask how different areas of inquiry associated with evolutionary research fit within it. So in this case, you begin by picking the abstract theory structure, figuring out what it is, before you ever would look at the evolutionary biological content. Okay, the idea is that you're looking at that abstract structure first before moving to look at the content. Now there's some potential advantages to this sort of strategy. You can get unification, potentially, of different areas and increased comprehension of the explanatory scope of theories. You also could isolate some previously unnoticed similarities in unrelated models when comparing them in this abstract structure. So as you bring the content into the abstract structure, you might find that as you are fitting it in, that there are interesting relationships you hadn't previously noticed, and that would be a bonus. It also has some potential drawbacks. You risk obscuring how theory guides investigation and explains phenomena in vivo because of being formulated separately from practices. Because you formulated the structure independently of the content, right, you are not looking at how it's being used, right, until your second step, or secondarily in some sense. Additionally, also the success in placing a theory within the abstract structure is no guarantee. There will be a payoff, right? So it might be when you put different models together in the structure, it's illuminating and it shows you something you didn't see before. It might be you put it all together and you go, huh, there it is. And there isn't much more that you learn in the process. It's a possibility. Now the concrete practice first strategy, again from the name, identifies and articulates theoretical practices in use within scientific communities to see how different domains of evolutionary research are structured by these practices. So in this case, in some sense, it's the reverse of the abstract structure. Instead of articulating abstract structure first, you start looking at what do people do and how does that structure look on the ground, right? Some potential advantages: clarifying why lines of investigation are organized in specific ways because you're looking directly at them and how they work. You can also make explicit the criteria of adequacy and related standards of evaluation that are operating. And that's really important because those sorts of differences can be a source of controversy within and across disciplines. And so if you can identify those, you can see this is a point of tension between two different approaches. There are also potential drawbacks. The structure may apply to only one area of investigation, and therefore it's less helpful for understanding other areas of science. So one thing you might want is to understand how different sciences have similarities. This sort of approach may not give you that. It also may not be illuminating if there's a high degree of flux in the area under scrutiny, because that's going to make it difficult to separate significant theoretical structure from idiosyncratic differences among researchers. So essentially what you need are patterns of practice that you can look at and not just what any one individual researcher is doing. Sometimes at moments in the history of science, we know that things can be in high degree of flux and those patterns might not be available, and it might be then harder to look and see structure in concrete practice. Now, importantly, I have preferences for my own methodology. I think different people will, but what I want to emphasize is that there's no perfect strategy for doing this. Each of these strategies is better suited to achieving some goals rather than others and has some distinctive blind spots, right? So in the abstract structure first approach, that suits epistemological endeavors that are one step removed from the daily use of knowledge, such as identifying relationships among disparate disciplines. However, it sometimes values things that appear beneficial but can act as obstacles to investigation. So single definitions with necessary and sufficient conditions look like really good things, but it turns out in some cases that actually can be an obstacle to doing research. The concrete practice first approach is germane when the aim is to understand why scientists do what they do, such as reasoning in a particular fashion or finding a type of explanation adequate. However, valuing that specificity of local criteria of adequacy can sometimes mean losing sight of a bigger picture within and among cognate sciences. So you kind of zoom in, consequence of zooming in, you lose a little bit of a larger frame and some of those connections. Strategies are not mutually exclusive and in some ways can be complementary. Now, what does that look like in action? Right? So those are two strategies. I very briefly want to sort of highlight what they might look like. Here I will be relatively quick. This I've tried to do a little bit more in this forthcoming paper. I chose Evo-devo in part because it's a perspicuous case study, but also because it's something I've been working on for quite a while, something I know relatively well. And the place of Evo-devo within evolutionary theory is contested, especially with respect to the origin of novelty. Evo-devo research aimed at explaining novelties has been a locus for criticizing standard evolutionary biological frameworks, so in terms of the dialectic about the EES. Here are a couple examples of that. Gunther Wagner, almost 20 years ago now. It does not help much to say that there were 1 or 2 mutations that created eye spots and that these alleles were selected. Gerhard Müller in 2007, Evo-devo emerged as a distinct field of research in the early 80s to address the profound neglect of development in the standard modern synthesis framework of evolutionary theory, a deficiency that had caused difficulties in explaining the origins of organismal form. So in both these cases, we see this sort of criticism emerging. Well, what would it look like if we adopted the abstract structure first approach to organizing knowledge to understand the relationship between Evo-devo and evolutionary theory? What might that look like? Well, to some degree, we got to pick an abstract structure. And what I did was look at one that falls in the family of mathematical principles or a small set of core axioms from the work of Sam Shiner and others, where he is trying to lay out a series of theories that encompass all of biology. He calls it an overarching theory. He actually has 5 general theories, one of which is evolution, and that's all I'm going to talk about here. But the important thing is he's trying to offer theory structure for all of biology, right? And he's offering that abstract structure in advance of the content. That is, you fit the content into the structure. I won't go over this in detail because there's just a lot involved here, but I want you to see what would it mean to have this abstract structure first. What it would mean, you have commitments like the following, and these come from Shiner, that you have 3 different types of theories: general theories, constitutive theories, and models. Those have hierarchical relations. They have different parts, background, general principles, outputs, and the like, and that you can further subdivide them: general principles, including concepts and confirmed generalizations; propositions, including concepts, confirmed generalizations, and laws, and so on. The point is not to get lost in that detail for now because we don't have time to go over it. The point is to see this is the abstract structure. This is the abstract structure that has been laid out in advance before you put the content in. And then what you would do is something like the following, where you would try and then say, well, evolutionary theory in this case fits as a general theory, right, with a particular domain: patterns, causes, and consequences of change, and the characteristics and diversity of life across generations and geological eras. And then you would try and lay out the fundamental principles. And so Shiner and colleagues come up with 8 fundamental principles for evolutionary theory. I'm not going to go over them all in detail. I've highlighted 3 of them in bold: variation as a prerequisite for evolution, variation arises from genetic properties, and properties of organisms condition evolution, because those are the ones that Shiner thinks allow you to see Evo-devo as a constitutive theory in this structure based on those 3 principles, where he says recent debates about the origin of phenotypic novelties as well as the emerging discipline of Evo-devo have focused on the meaning of and the mechanisms of these underlying fundamental principles. You get a domain for the constitutive theory: genetic and morphological variation among organismal traits within and across species that is relevant to how ontogeny changes over time and how ontogenetic processes have a causal impact on evolutionary change in terms of constraint and facilitation. Now, there's more that you can say about the fit, and I try and do that in this paper. I'm not going to do that here today. What I hope you can just start to see is how we took an abstract structure and then we started to fit content into it using this particular strategy. You can get some interesting results out of that, right? So this situates Evo-devo within evolutionary theory in terms of explaining the evolution of morphology. It recovers some of the rationale for why Evo-devo is distinctive in the sense of fleshing out some fundamental principles. And it offers an affirmative answer to the hierarchical ordering of Evo-devo within evolutionary theory, seeing how it can be understood as fleshing out those abstract principles and consistent with other ideas where you're trying to understand structure as a small set of axioms or core principles. Now, I'll say less about the concrete practice first because I've already mentioned that this is the way I have been trying to approach this. I'll just mention a few results, I think, of this approach, which, when you look at the structure that's already there in the sciences to allow and facilitate inquiry, I think what you see are some of the following with respect to novelty and Evo-devo: that controversies over definitions of concepts are best understood in terms of divergent criteria of explanatory adequacy. Basically, people are not all trying to do the same thing. Because they're not all trying to do the same thing, they don't all have the same definitions. Although qualitative departures from the ancestral condition have been emphasized, a continuum between qualitative difference and quantitative variant make it difficult to distinguish novelty from non-novelty. Biologists draw lines on the continuum differently based on what they're trying to do: distinct, investigative, and explanatory aims. Those different meanings then point to distinct expectations. We can sometimes track those by looking at allied concepts that are being marshaled in those different research projects. Second, I think more broadly, it helps identify some of the problematic assumptions that we saw earlier, such as that there's a single evolutionary theory in these discussions of an EES with an uncomplicated structure and described with those associated spatial metaphors. These problematic assumptions obscure how Evo-devo is individuated, and I think encourage folks to understand the criteria of adequacy as universal across all areas of evolutionary biology. Additionally, this decentralized approach questions whether evolutionary genetics should always be considered the core of evolutionary biology. Importantly, the practice orientation here drives this view of structure, right? Because biologists work with a small set of models rather than an entire theory, always some subset of them, and that means they oftentimes idealize away from the other features of the theory. Nobody works with the whole theory simultaneously at one time. Okay, that brings me to my last section, pluralism, and trying to argue that we should structure knowledge contextually. There's a lot of talk about a new grand synthesis, right? And in fact, whether it's positive or sometimes negative in terms of criticism, there's emphasis on the need for a central theory or grand synthesis is kind of predominant. Here, Gerd Mueller says, to unite pertinent concepts that emerge from the novel fields within elements of the standard theory. So this uniting is really important. Evolutionary biology as practiced today does not represent a single coherent approach. But I want to sort of push us to ask, why do we want complete unification? Why do we want only a single approach? What is the motivation for that? It's really a monist expectation, where by monism I mean a single unified account, or that there's a single perspicuous representation system within which all the correct accounts can be expressed. That's what the desire is when you want complete unification or a single grand synthesis. I think we should have lots of reasons to pause about that with respect to evolutionary biology, not least of which is that for a long time now, people have worried about the epistemic organization of evolutionary theory and modern synthesis, and long before any of our current controversial discussions have been happening, Jean Gaillon, I think, nicely put it, that it's very difficult to define the modern synthesis as a theory. It's indeed questionable whether the modern synthesis should be considered as one single theory. And lots of diverse proposals have been offered as a consequence. I'm not going to go over them because what I think it reveals is the same point we saw earlier, that there's more than one way to structure this space of knowledge, and that we should then be careful about assuming that there's a single grand sort of package altogether behind it. So what I want to plea for is pluralism, right, and say that, look, one interpretation of what we've seen so far is that the failure to settle on a single structure for knowledge in evolutionary biology is because a single perspicuous representation system within which all correct accounts can be expressed doesn't serve the diverse goals of evolutionary biology. So that's the monist expectation, to have that single account, but it doesn't help scientists do what they want to do. Okay? And to adopt that kind of structure is to foreclose or make more difficult certain kinds of activities that scientists want to engage in. And so I want to urge a pluralist stance, which is a commitment to avoid reliance on those monist assumptions in interpretation or evaluation, coupled with an openness to the ineliminability of multiplicity in some scientific contexts. So the idea that actually the multiplicity of scientific knowledge structures is something that we would expect and in some sense encourage because it allows those goals to be achieved. If we rely only on monist assumptions, we can encourage obscuring certain aspects of the structure of knowledge that are important because we don't see what we don't expect. I think most importantly, the advantages of pluralism focuses on why we would structure knowledge in the first place, the aims. And I've given here a number of different aims. I've put in bold the aims that are kind of the most attended to in some of the discussions in the EES about facilitating ongoing research, stimulating new inquiry. But notice also you might have other aims, like presenting the theory pedagogically, right? And that all of these aims are aims that would give you different reasons to structure knowledge in certain ways. Success in structuring the knowledge in one way with respect to one aim is unlikely to yield success with respect to another. Trade-offs are likely. But importantly, an advantage here is that those different aims provide diverse criteria for deciding when and where different theory structure is legitimate. Okay? So it's actually giving us an explanation of why we should expect to find diverse structures within the context of evolutionary biology. Finally, an advantage is we can actually learn from failures. Right? There's no reason why when we attempt to structure knowledge, we will always succeed. Sometimes we will fail. When we fail, what we would really like to do is learn from it. And I think in this sort of strategy, right, the learning from failing to structure knowledge in a particular way is to learn how that structure doesn't allow us to achieve goals that we have for particular research projects in view. So I think divergent knowledge structures serve different sets of methodological and epistemological goals in evolutionary theory. Knowledge is structured contextually. A pluralist stance can recognize the fruitfulness of maintaining this diversity. Unification for the sake of a fully general or overarching conceptual framework is not the ultimate goal. I just think we need to be really cautious about assuming that, and in many cases I think it goes unquestioned. I think it's crucial to maintain pluralism in research communities that differ over the interpretation and significance of phenomena or mechanisms, and for the ongoing incorporation of new empirical findings. That's the situation I think we are in. So expectations matter. I think the conceptual basis of some existing controversies about theoretical frameworks in evolutionary biology derive from expecting a single comprehensive theory with one main structure. Right? That helps us understand why we're seeing some of the controversy that we are seeing, and that adopting pluralism provides novel ways of structuring our evolving knowledge for future interdisciplinary inquiry, because there are different ways to structure knowledge that are suited to achieving different aims. That's what we would want and hope for. So, to sort of close, let me go back to my opening questions, right? Where I asked you to envision what knowledge looks like, sort of in your own area or nearby, right? What I would hope, if I'd had a chance to ask each of you individually, which would have taken all day, which I didn't do that, is that you would have given me many different ways that the knowledge is structured in the areas that you work in, and it's based in some sense on differences in research questions and problems. However, what I've been trying to argue in the context of this talk more broadly is that when you look at what you expect knowledge to look like, that is, what should it be how should it be structured, right? That in fact, you should expect it to be structured in many different ways. And that's normal, fruitful, and should be something that by making explicit, we can do better research as a consequence. Thank you.